New York society branded Isabella Calloway the Ice Queen because she refused to weep when Richard Sterling destroyed their marriage. Everyone assumed her silence signaled defeat as he paraded his young mistress through town. She vanished into the shadows, leaving observers convinced she was broken. But silence isn't always surrender. Often it is a calculated strategy. 2 years later, Isabella returned to the very gala that shunned her, wearing a rare ring Richard's millions could never purchase. She didn't just survive the divorce. Tonight, you will witness how she returned to actually buy the whole game and destroy his legacy. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the generic glass monolith in Midtown Manhattan smelled of stale coffee and aggressive cologne. It was the scent of expensive billable hours. Isabella Calloway sat at the long mahogany table, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. She was wearing a charcoal dress, high-necked, unpresuming. It was the kind of dress you wore to a funeral, or in her case, the autopsy of a 15-year marriage. Across the table sat Richard Sterling. He was 52, though his perfectly capped teeth and weekly chemical peels fought hard to suggest 45. He was leaning back in his Herman Miller chair, checking his watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus that cost more than most people's college tuition. He looked bored. Next to him was his lawyer, a bulldog of a man named Arthur Pendleton, known in the city as the Butcher of Park Avenue. Pendleton was currently listing Richard's assets, or rather the lack thereof. As you can see in Exhibit C, Pendleton said, sliding a thick binder across the table. Mr. Sterling's liquidity is currently tied up in offshore investments which have underperformed. The Hamptons estate is heavily leveraged. The portfolio has taken a hit. Frankly, Mrs. Sterling, the settlement offer of $2 million and the apartment in Connecticut is generous given the current climate. $2 million. They were worth, conservatively, $400 million. Isabella knew it. Richard knew she knew it. But the most deafening thing in the room wasn't Pendleton's droning voice. It was Isabella's silence. For 6 months she hadn't spoken a word to Richard. Not when he came home at 3 a.m. smelling of vanilla perfume that wasn't hers. Not when the photos of him and the 23-year-old Instagram model, Chloe Vane, surfaced on page 6. Not even when he served her the papers on her birthday. She just stared at him. Richard hated it. He wanted a scream. He wanted a fight. He wanted her to throw a vase so he could call her unstable and justify what he was doing. But she gave him nothing. She was a statue. Isabella. Richard sighed, breaking protocol. He leaned forward, flashing that charming, shark-like grin that had once made her weak in the knees at the crisp age of 22. Look, let's be adults. You don't need the hassle of a trial. You've never been good with numbers. You'll take the Connecticut place. You'll paint. You'll garden. It's what you're good at. Leave the business to the people who built it. The people who built it. Isabella's eyes flickered to his, just for a second. She remembered the nights in their first cramped apartment in Brooklyn, proofreading his pitch decks until her eyes burned. She remembered pawning her grandmother's pearl choker to pay for the incorporation fees of Sterling Global. She remembered the dinner parties where she charmed investors while he was in the bathroom doing lines of coke to calm his nerves. She built it. He just stood on top of it. Her lawyer, a sharp, quiet woman named Sarah Jenkins, looked at Isabella. Sarah was the opposite of Pendleton. She didn't bark, she waited. My client, Sarah said softly, accepts the terms. Pendleton blinked. Richard froze, his pen hovering over the paper. She... what? Richard asked, squinting. She accepts the terms, Sarah repeated. 2 million, the Connecticut cottage, and a clean break, today. Richard looked at Isabella, searching for the trap. There had to be a trap. Isabella was the daughter of a diplomat. She spoke 4 languages. She had a master's in art history from the Sorbonne. She wasn't stupid. Bella? Richard asked, his voice dropping an octave. You're serious? Isabella reached into her purse. She pulled out a fountain pen, a Mont Blanc he had given her for their 5th anniversary. She uncapped it, the sound sharp in the silent room. She signed the papers, a fluid, elegant scrawl. Then she stood up. She didn't look at the papers. She didn't look at Pendleton. She looked Richard dead in the eye. Goodbye, Richard, she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 180 days. She turned and walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the floor. "Well," Pendleton laughed nervously, loosening his tie. "That was easier than I thought. Broken woman, Richard. You broke her completely." Richard stared at the closed door, a strange knot forming in his stomach. He had won. He had kept the fortune, the Hamptons house, the yacht, and he was free to marry Chloe. So why did he feel like he had just walked into a firing squad? The divorce was finalized in record time. The tabloids had a field day. Silent surrender, why Isabella Sterling walked away with pennies. Richard's new flame, Chloe Vane moves into the penthouse. New York society is a brutal ecosystem. It operates on proximity to power. When Isabella was Mrs. Richard Sterling, she was the queen of the Upper East Side. She chaired the Met Gala committee. She organized the botanical garden lunches. People laughed at her jokes, even when they weren't funny. But the moment the ink was dry, the invitations stopped coming. Her friends, women she had vacationed with in Saint-Tropez, women whose children she had godmothered, ghosted her. They didn't want to upset Richard. Richard was the one with the private jet. Richard was the one who could get their husbands into the Augusta National Golf Club. Isabella was just collateral damage. She moved to the Connecticut cottage. It was a misnomer. It was a drafty, dilapidated farmhouse in Litchfield County that hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. The paint was peeling, the heating rattled, and it was 2 hours away from the city. For the first 6 months, Isabella disappeared. Meanwhile, Richard was living the high life. He renovated the Park Avenue penthouse, turning Isabella's elegant, library-filled sanctuary into a white marble, minimalist nightclub. Chloe Vane, now sporting a rock the size of a skating rink, posted daily Instagram stories from Isabella's old dressing room. New life, new vibes. Blessed sterling gold. Richard felt invincible. Sterling Global stock was up. He was being courted for a seat on the board of the Harrington Foundation, the most exclusive philanthropic organization in the Western Hemisphere. The Harrington Gala was the event of the decade, held once every 5 years in London. To be invited was a status symbol. To be a board member was godhood. Richard wanted that seat. He needed to prove that shedding Isabella hadn't hurt his standing. One afternoon, Richard was lunching at Le Bernardin with Arthur Pendleton. "Have we heard anything from her?" Richard asked, swirling his scotch. He wouldn't admit it, but his curiosity was itching. "Isabella," Pendleton scoffed, dissecting his tuna tartare. "Not a peep. My sources say she's practically a hermit. Hired a local contractor to fix the roof. She's probably planting tulips and knitting sweaters." "You won, Richard. Stop looking in the rearview mirror." Richard nodded, satisfied. "Good. The Harrington Gala invitations go out next month. I'm bringing Chloe. It's going to be her debut. Risky," Pendleton warned. "The Harringtons are old school. They liked Isabella." "They like money, Arthur," Richard snapped. "And I have more of it than ever." But Richard didn't know what Isabella was doing in that farmhouse. She wasn't knitting. The day she arrived in Connecticut, Isabella walked into the dusty study, swept the cobwebs off the desk, and opened her laptop. She didn't plant tulips. She planted seeds of a different kind. She made 3 phone calls. The first was to a man named Sebastian Gray. No one in New York talked about Sebastian Gray, because Sebastian Gray didn't exist on Google. He was a broker of information, a fixer for the European aristocracy, and an old friend from Isabella's days at the Sorbonne before she became Mrs. Sterling. "Sebastian," she said when he picked up. "Bella," his voice was like velvet and smoke. "I heard about the settlement. 2 million? You're losing your touch." "I needed the cash liquid and immediate, and I needed him to think I was defeated," she said, her voice sharp, devoid of the fragility she had shown in the lawyer's office. "I need you to liquidate my grandmother's trust. The one Richard doesn't know about, the one in Zurich. That's a nuclear option, Bella. That's the family jewels. Do it, and Sebastian, I need a meeting with the House of Andalusia." There was a long pause on the line. The Spanish royal jewelers, they haven't taken a private commission in 40 years. They only work for the crown. "Tell them," Isabella said, looking out the window at the overgrown garden, "that the girl who identified the stolen Goya in Paris 15 years ago is calling in her favor." Sebastian laughed, a low, dark sound. "Oh, this is going to be fun. Richard thinks you're dead, doesn't he?" "Let him think it," Isabella said. "I don't want to be alive. I want to be a ghost, because ghosts are the only things that can haunt you without being seen." 18 months passed. The silence from Connecticut was absolute. To the New York elites, Isabella Calloway was a cautionary tale, a woman who aged out of her utility and was discarded. Richard Sterling was riding high. He had secured his nomination for the Harrington Board. The gala was set for December in London at the Royal Albert Hall. It was going to be the most extravagant night in British society. The invitations arrived in boxes made of black velvet, embossed with gold leaf. Richard opened his with a flourish at the breakfast table. Chloe was busy taking a selfie with her matcha latte. "We're in," Richard grinned, holding up the heavy card. "Top-tier seating, royal box adjacent." Chloe squealed. "Do I have to wear black? I want to wear red, bright red." "Wear whatever you want," Richard said, feeling magnanimous. "Just make sure it's expensive." He scanned the guest list included in the briefing packet. It was a who's who of global power: the Prime Minister, the Duke of Westminster, tech moguls, and then his eyes caught a name near the bottom of the patrons list. Ms. Isabella Calloway. Richard froze. "What is it?" Chloe asked, sensing the shift in the air. "She's invited," Richard muttered. "Isabella. She's on the list." Chloe laughed, a harsh, tinkling sound. "So?" "She probably bought a pity ticket with her alimony money. She'll show up in some dusty old rag, stand in the back, and eat the free shrimp. It'll make us look even better, Richard. You with me, young, hot, rich. Her alone and sad." Richard slowly relaxed. Chloe was right. This was actually perfect. If Isabella showed up, it would be the final nail in her coffin. He would greet her with pity. He would introduce her to Chloe. He would show the world that he had upgraded and she had stagnated. "You're right." Richard kissed Chloe's forehead. "Let her come. It'll be a good show." The night of the gala, London. The air in London was biting cold, but the press line outside the Royal Albert Hall was blazing hot. Flashbulbs popped like strobes as limousines deposited billionaires and countesses onto the red carpet. Richard stepped out of his Rolls-Royce Phantom, looking dapper in a Savile Row tuxedo. On his arm, Chloe wore a custom Versace gown in screaming scarlet, slashed down to the navel. It was loud. It was aggressive. It screamed new money, but Richard didn't care. He waved to the cameras. "Mr. Sterling! Mr. Sterling, over here!" They walked the carpet, basking in the attention. Richard scanned the crowd, looking for a sad, lonely figure in a charcoal dress. He didn't see her. She'd probably chickened out, Chloe whispered, checking her makeup in her phone camera. They moved inside the great hall. It was a sea of diamonds and black ties. Waiters circulated with vintage champagne. The air smelled of expensive flowers and old power. Richard began to work the room. He shook hands with the CEO of BP. He nodded to a Saudi prince. He felt like the king of the world. Then the room changed. It wasn't a sound, it was the lack of sound. A hush started near the grand entrance and rippled through the crowd like a wave. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered, heads turned. "Who is that?" Someone whispered near Richard. Richard turned around, annoyed that someone was stealing his spotlight. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was a woman. For a second, Richard didn't recognize her. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet, so dark it looked almost black. But when the light hit it, it shimmered like the night sky. It was strapless, structured, hugging a body that was leaner, stronger, and more statuesque than he remembered. Her hair, usually worn in a sensible bob, was long now, styled in glamorous, old Hollywood waves that cascaded over one shoulder. It was Isabella, but it wasn't the Isabella he divorced. That Isabella was soft, beige, and apologetic. This woman was terrifying. She began to descend the stairs. She wasn't walking, she was gliding. Every eye in the room was glued to her. She was alone, but she didn't look lonely. She looked like she owned the stairs, the building, and everyone in it. "Is that his ex-wife?" a woman whispered loudly. "My God." She looks incredible. I heard she was living in a shack. Another man muttered, that dress is haute couture, Givenchy archival, you can't even buy that. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. Chloe gripped his arm, her nails digging in. Why is everyone looking at her? She hissed. She looks like a witch. Isabella reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd parted for her, a red sea of tuxedos splitting for Moses. She walked straight toward the center of the room, where the chairman of the Harrington Foundation, Lord Evelyn Harrington, was holding court. Lord Harrington was a man who famously never smiled. When he saw Isabella, his face lit up. Isabella, my dear, Lord Harrington boomed, bypassing Richard completely to take Isabella's hands. We were terrified you wouldn't make it from the airport. I wouldn't miss it, Evelyn, Isabella said. Her voice was different too, lower, huskier. The jet had a slight delay in Zurich. You know how the fog gets. The jet? Richard's brain short-circuited. Isabella didn't have a jet. She flew commercial economy. He made sure of it. Isabella turned, and for the first time her gaze swept the room. It landed on Richard. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked at him with a cool, detached amusement, like a scientist looking at a bug in a jar. And then she raised her left hand to tuck a lock of hair behind her ear. That was when the room gasped. On her ring finger, where Richard's modest 2-carat diamond used to sit, was a ring. But not just a ring. It was a massive radiant cut blue diamond, flanked by rare pink argyle diamonds set in platinum filigree that looked like woven spiderwebs. It was the size of a quail's egg. It pulsed with an inner fire under the chandeliers. Richard stopped breathing. He knew that ring. Every billionaire in the room knew that ring. It was the Star of Andalusia. It was legendary. It was supposed to be in the vault of the Spanish royal family. Richard himself had tried to inquire about buying it for Chloe 3 months ago to prove his status. He was told, very rudely, that the ring was not for sale to commoners and was reserved for blood or history. And now it was on his ex-wife's finger. Oh my God, a banker next to Richard choked. Is she engaged? To whom? A Bourbon, a Habsburg. Chloe looked at the ring, then at her own diamond. Suddenly, her rock looked like a piece of glass from a Cracker Jack box. Richard, Chloe whined, what is going on? Isabella began to walk toward them. The distance between Richard Sterling and Isabella Calloway was only 20 feet. But it felt like a canyon separating two different realities. On one side stood the desperate, sweating grasp of new money. On the other, the cool, untouchable aura of legacy. Isabella didn't stop walking until she was close enough for Richard to smell her perfume. It wasn't the soft floral scent she used to wear, the one he'd once told her was too boring. This scent was complex, oud, leather, and crushed rose petals. It smelled like danger. Richard straightened his tie, his survival instincts warring with his ego. He decided to attack first. It was the only move he knew. Isabella, he said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. He put on a pitying smile. I'm surprised to see you. I didn't think you could afford the ticket price these days. Did you win a raffle? A few people nearby gasped. It was a crude, brutal opening. Chloe giggled, emboldened by his arrogance. She looked Isabella up and down, crinkling her nose. And that dress, Chloe chimed in, her voice shrill. It looks heavy, a bit dusty, isn't it? Richard, didn't your mother have curtains like that? The silence that followed was excruciating. Lord Harrington, standing nearby, looked ready to call security on Richard. But Isabella laughed. It was a soft, genuine laugh, as if a child had just told a joke they didn't understand. Hello, Richard, she said. She turned her eyes to Chloe, her expression softening into mock sympathy. And you must be Chloe. I recognize you from the Instagram stories. She reached out and lightly touched the fabric of her own gown. You have a sharp eye, Chloe, Isabella said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed hall. This dress is old. It was commissioned in 1954 by Hubert de Givenchy for the Countess of Bismarck. It hasn't been worn since the night she dined with Kennedy. It's not fashion, my dear. It's history. But I wouldn't expect you to know that. History isn't really trending on TikTok, is it? A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was deadly. Chloe's face turned the same shade as her crimson dress. Richard stepped forward, his face hardening. He felt the room slipping away from him. He needed to regain control. He grabbed Isabella's left hand, the one with the ring, and held it up, ostensibly to inspect it, but really to mock it. "And this?" Richard sneered, looking at the massive blue diamond. "Costume jewelry, Bella. Really? Trying to impress the old crowd with glass? It's a bit gaudy, even for you." He expected her to pull away, to flush with embarrassment. Instead, Isabella left her hand in his grip. She looked down at him, her eyes icy. "Careful, Richard," she whispered. "You're holding the GDP of a small nation." "Please," Richard scoffed, dropping her hand. "Who gave it to you? Who are you sleeping with? Some senile oil tycoon?" Lord Harrington stepped in then, his face thunderous. "Mr. Sterling," he boomed, "that is enough." "It's all right, Evelyn," Isabella said, raising a hand to stop the older man. She looked back at Richard. "You always did have a hard time understanding value, Richard. You think this ring is something a man gives a woman to mark her as property. You think I'm wearing an engagement ring." She twisted the ring on her finger. The blue stone caught the light, fracturing it into 1,000 dazzling sparks. "This isn't an engagement ring," she said. "It's a signet." "A signet?" Richard frowned. "For what?" "For the consortium," she said simply. She didn't explain, she didn't have to. She turned her back on him, dismissing him as if he were the waiter. "Come, Evelyn," she said to Lord Harrington. "I believe the chairman's table is waiting. We have much to discuss regarding the Asian market expansion." "Indeed we do, my dear," Harrington said, offering her his arm. They walked away, heading toward the raised VIP platform in the center of the hall, an area roped off by velvet cords, guarded by security. It was the inner sanctum, reserved for the Board of Governors and their guests of honor. Richard and Chloe were left standing on the edge of the dance floor. A waiter appeared next to Richard. "Sir, your table is ready. Table 47. It's back there, near the kitchen doors." Richard stared at Isabella's retreating back. She was ascending the stairs to the VIP platform, sitting down next to the Duke of Westminster. "What is the consortium?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. "Richard, why is she sitting with the Duke?" Richard didn't answer. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He knew about the consortium. Every high-level financier knew the rumors. It was a shadow group, old European money, families like the Agnelis, the Rothschilds, the ancient Spanish dynasties that pooled their liquidity to stabilize markets or crash them. They didn't have a website. They didn't have a headquarters. They had signets, and Isabella was wearing one. "We need to leave," Richard muttered. "But we just got here," Chloe whined. "I said we need to leave," Richard hissed. He grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the exit. He needed to get to a phone. He needed to call Arthur Pendleton, because if Isabella Calloway was part of the consortium, she wasn't just his ex-wife anymore. She was his executioner. The next morning, 6 a.m. Sterling Global Headquarters, Wall Street. Richard hadn't slept. He was in his office, the skyline of Manhattan gray and bleak outside his window. His desk was covered in files. Arthur Pendleton sat on the leather sofa, looking disheveled. He had been summoned at 4 a.m. "Tell me you found something," Richard barked. "It's complicated," Pendleton said, rubbing his eyes. "I ran a check on the ring. You were right. It's the Star of Andalusia. It was last seen in the possession of the House of Alba in Spain, but it wasn't sold. Then how did she have it?" "It was gifted," Pendleton said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk, or rather, passed down. Richard picked up the paper. It was a photocopy of an old obituary from a Swiss newspaper dated 2 years ago. Baroness Helena von Hartz. Richard frowned. "Von Hartz? The Steele dynasty? What does she have to do with Isabella?" "Read the second paragraph," Pendleton said. Richard squinted. "The Baroness, a recluse in her final years, is survived by no children. Her estate, valued at approximately 12 billion euros, has been placed in a private trust managed by her sole companion and confidante of 20 years. The name had been redacted in the public version." "Isabella," Richard whispered. "I dug deeper," Pendleton said, his voice dropping. "Richard, think back, 15 years ago, when you were starting Sterling Global. You sent Isabella to Europe to scout investors because you were too busy trying to close the deal with Lehman Brothers. She spent 3 months in Zurich. Richard remembered. He had been glad to get her out of the way. She had come back quiet, saying she had made some friends who enjoyed art. She wasn't just looking at paintings, Pendleton said. She was working. She was translating legal documents for Helena von Hartz. She was managing the old woman's correspondence. She became the daughter the Baroness never had. When the Baroness died, she left Isabella the keys to the kingdom. Richard sank into his chair. So she has money. So what? I have money. Sterling Global is worth $3 billion. It's not just money, Richard, Pendleton said, looking pale. The von Hartz family holds the controlling debt in 3 major banks. Specifically, the 3 banks that underwrite your loans. The room spun. Sterling Global was leveraged. Heavily. Richard had borrowed against the company to buy the penthouse, the yacht, and to fund the aggressive expansion into Asia. If the banks called in the loans, he was finished. She owns my debt? Richard asked, his voice cracking. Technically, the trust owns it, but she controls the trust. Richard stood up and walked to the window. He felt like he was going to vomit. The silence, the refusal to fight for more alimony, the quiet exit to Connecticut. It wasn't surrender. She was clearing the blast zone. She waited, Richard realized. She waited until I leveraged myself to the hilt for the Asia expansion. She waited until I was most vulnerable. And there's one more thing, Pendleton said. He hesitated. The Harrington board seat, the one you've been campaigning for. What about it? The Von Hartz Trust is the largest donor to the Harrington Foundation. They have veto power over new board members. Richard slammed his fist onto the desk. She's going to block me. No, Pendleton said. She's not going to block you. What? I got a call from the foundation this morning. Your nomination has been fast-tracked. They want to interview you today, at noon. In the boardroom. Richard blinked. She approved me. It seems so. Richard began to pace. Why would she do that? If she wanted to destroy him, she would block the seat. She would call the loans. Why let him in? Unless... A slow, arrogant smile began to creep back onto Richard's face. She still loves me, he said. Pendleton looked skeptical. Richard. Think about it, Arthur. Richard laughed, the manic energy returning. She's showing off. She's flashing the ring. She's flashing the power. But she's approving my seat. She wants me to see her as an equal. She wants me back. He smoothed his hair. She realized that money is boring without a man to share it with. She's posturing. It's a mating dance. I wouldn't bet on that, Pendleton warned. I would, Richard said. He grabbed his jacket. I'm going to that meeting. I'm going to charm the board, and then I'm going to invite Isabella to dinner. I'll apologize. Tell her I made a mistake with Chloe. Chloe is a headache anyway. Isabella. Isabella comes with 12 billion euros. The trap is set. Richard arrived at the Harrington Foundation's New York offices at 11:55 a.m. He walked with a swagger he didn't quite feel, but he faked it well. The receptionist nodded to him. Mr. Sterling, they are waiting for you in the obsidian room. He pushed open the heavy double doors. The room was dimly lit. A long oval table sat in the center. At the far end sat 3 people. Lord Harrington was in the middle. To his left was a man Richard didn't know, a Swiss lawyer type, and to his right sat Isabella. She wasn't wearing the gown today. She was wearing a white power suit, sharp as a razor blade. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. The blue diamond ring sat on the table in front of her, next to a stack of files. Richard, Lord Harrington said, not smiling. Please sit. Richard sat at the opposite end of the table. He flashed his best smile at Isabella. She didn't return it. She was reading a document. We have reviewed your application for the board. Lord Harrington began. Your financials are aggressive, but impressive. Fortune favors the bold, Richard said, winking at Isabella. Indeed, Isabella said. She didn't look up. Her voice was dry, professional. However, the board has a strict policy regarding the solvency of its members. We cannot have a board member whose company is at risk of imminent default. Default? Richard laughed. Sterling Global is posting record profits. On paper, the Swiss lawyer said, but we have analyzed your debt structure. You have $400 million in short-term loans due next week, the balloon payment for the Asia expansion. That's standard. Richard waved his hand. The banks always roll that over. I've been banking with Deutsche and Chase for 20 years. They'll extend the term. Isabella finally looked up. Actually, Richard, she said, they won't. Richard froze. Excuse me. Deutsche and Chase sold your debt packages this morning, Isabella said. She tapped the file in front of her. To a private equity firm called Chimera Holdings. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Chimera. The monster. And, Isabella continued, her eyes locking onto his, Chimera Holdings has instructed me to inform you that they will not be rolling over the debt. They are calling it in full, by 5 p.m. tomorrow. You, Richard stood up, his legs shaking. You are Chimera. I am the majority shareholder, yes? Isabella said calmly. Sit down, Richard. You can't do this, Richard shouted. If I have to pay $400 million tomorrow, I'll have to liquidate everything. The stock will crash. I'll lose the company. Yes, Isabella said. That is the math. Why? Richard whispered. I thought. You approved the board seat. I did, Isabella said. She stood up slowly. It's because I wanted you to be in the room when it happened. I didn't want you to read about it in the paper. I wanted to look you in the eye. She picked up the ring from the table and slid it onto her finger. You said I was weak, Richard. You said I was good at gardening. You were right. I am very good at gardening. She leaned over the table. And you, Richard, you are a weed. 2 p.m., the day of reckoning, Richard Sterling ran out of the Harrington Foundation building like a man on fire. The cool composure he had practiced for decades was gone, replaced by a feral, sweating panic. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he dropped it on the sidewalk, cracking the screen. He dialed Arthur Pendleton. Arthur! Stop the trading. Richard screamed into the phone as he hailed a cab. Suspend the stock. Tell the SEC there's a glitch. Anything. I can't, Richard. Pendleton's voice was hollow. The news is already out. Bloomberg just ran the headline. Chimera Holdings calls Sterling debt. The stock is in freefall. It's down 40% in 20 minutes. The sharks smell blood. Who leaked it? Richard roared. Isabella, Pendleton said, or her team. It was a coordinated press release the second you walked into that meeting. Richard hung up. He sat in the back of the yellow taxi, watching the city blur past. The city he thought he owned now, every skyscraper looked like a tombstone. He needed liquidity. He needed cash to pay Chimera by 5 p.m. tomorrow, or he would lose the company. He dialed his friends. He called Marcus Thorne, the hedge fund manager he'd vacationed with in Aspen. Sorry, Richard, bad timing. I'm tied up in crypto. Click. He called Julian Vance, the real estate mogul. Richard, old boy, I heard. Tough break. Look, I can't lend, but if you're selling the Hamptons house, I'll take it off your hands for, let's say, 10 million. Cash today. It's worth 40. Richard screamed. Not when you're desperate, it isn't. Click. By the time the taxi pulled up to his Park Avenue penthouse, Richard knew it was over. The business was dead, but he still had the assets. The penthouse, the art, the jewelry. Entrance, he burst into the apartment. Chloe, he shouted. Chloe, pack your bags. We're going to the Caymans. I have accounts there. We can start over. We just need to move fast. He ran into the master bedroom. The room was in chaos. Suitcases were open on the bed. Isabella's old Louis Vuitton trunks that Chloe had appropriated. Chloe was throwing clothes into them, but she wasn't packing for a vacation. She was packing only her things. Thank God you're packing, Richard panted, loosening his tie. Grab the jewelry box. The emeralds specifically. Chloe paused. She turned to look at him. She was wearing a trench coat and sunglasses, even though they were indoors. I already grabbed the emeralds, Richard, she said coldly, and the Cartier watch, and the diamond studs you gave me for my birthday. Good, good, Richard nodded, pacing. We can sell those if we need to. Chloe let out a short, sharp laugh. She zipped up the suitcase. There is no we, Richard, I saw the news. You're broke. Actually, you're worse than broke. You're toxic. Richard stopped pacing. Chloe, what are you talking about? I'm Richard Sterling. I can bounce back. I just need a year. I don't have a year, Chloe snapped. I'm 24. I'm in my prime. I'm not going to waste it living in a rental apartment in, where? New Jersey, while you fight lawsuits. She dragged the suitcase off the bed. The wheels clattered loudly on the marble floor, the floor Isabella had chosen, the floor Richard had paid for. You can't leave me, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. I left my wife for you. I bought you everything. Chloe stopped at the door. She looked back, not with anger, but with boredom. You left your wife because you were having a midlife crisis, Richard, and you bought me things because that was the deal. I looked good. You paid for it. The payment stopped. She pulled the door open. Two large men in black t-shirts were waiting in the hall to carry her bags. Goodbye, Richard, she said. Good luck with the gardening. The door clicked shut. Richard stood alone in the silent white penthouse. It felt like a mausoleum. He walked to the window and looked down at Park Avenue. He felt small. He realized then that he had never really built anything. Isabella had built the business. His father had left him the initial seed money. The connections were family friends. Even his mistress was a transaction. He was a man made of paper, standing in a storm. The final plea, he had one card left to play. The emotional card. He knew Isabella. Beneath the ice, beneath the chimera persona, she was the woman who had nursed him through pneumonia. She was the woman who had cried when their dog died. She had a heart. He just had to find it. He washed his face, put on a fresh suit, a humbler one, navy blue, and drove himself to the Pierre Hotel, where he knew she was staying. He didn't have an appointment, but the doorman recognized him. The doorman also looked at him with pity. She's in the lounge, Mr. Sterling, the doorman said quietly. High tea. Richard walked into the rotunda room. It was painted with murals of a pastoral paradise. Isabella was sitting at a corner table reading a book, The Count of Monte Cristo. The irony was not lost on him. She didn't look up when he approached. Bella, he said softly. She turned a page. You have 3 minutes, Richard. I have a meeting with the SEC at 4:00. He pulled out a chair and sat down, disregarding protocol. He reached across the table, trying to take her hand. She moved it away, picking up her teacup. Bella, please, Richard said, his eyes welling up with actual tears. I'm ruined. They're going to take everything. The company, the house, my reputation. I know, she said, taking a sip of Earl Grey. I designed it that way. Why? He pleaded. Is this revenge? Is this about the affair? I'm sorry, Bella. I'm so sorry. I was an idiot. I was weak. But to destroy everything we built, 15 years of work, why burn it down? Isabella set the cup down. The china clicked against the saucer. I didn't burn it down, Richard, she said. I harvested it. She looked him in the eye. You think this is about Chloe? You think I'm a scorned woman, acting out of jealousy? She shook her head slightly. That would be beneath me. Then what? It's about respect, she said. When we married, we were partners. I worked as hard as you. I sacrificed my career in Paris for your ambition in New York. And when you decided you were done with me, you didn't just leave. You tried to erase me. You told the lawyers I was unskilled. You told our friends I was fragile. You tried to rewrite history to make yourself the sole architect of our success. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. I am not a footnote in your biography, Richard. I am the author. Richard stared at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He realized, for the first time, that he had never really known her. He had married a reflection of what he wanted, but he had divorced a titan. I can't pay the debt, Richard admitted, slumping in his chair. I have nothing. I know, Isabella said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. Richard's heart leaped. Was she going to write him a check? Was she going to save him? She wrote a check, tore it out, and slid it across the table. Richard looked at it. It was for $2 million. What is this? He asked. The settlement, she said. You gave me $2 million to go away. I'm returning it. I don't need your money anymore, Richard. I have my own. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Consider the debt called. Chimera Holdings will take possession of Sterling Global's assets tomorrow morning. You can keep the penthouse, but the maintenance fees will bankrupt you within 6 months, so I suggest you sell. Arthur Pendleton has already offered to handle the bankruptcy proceedings for you. He's very good. Bella. Goodbye, Richard, she said. She walked away, her heels clicking on the marble, leaving him alone with a check for $2 million and a life that was worth zero. 6 months later, the auction room at Sotheby's on York Avenue was vibrating with a specific frequency, the hum of predatory excitement. It was the same energy found at a gladiator match or a public execution, though the violence here was financial, not physical. The event was titled The Dissolution of the Sterling Empire, a name that carried a grim finality. New York's elite had gathered not out of respect for Richard Sterling, but to pick the meat off the bones of his legacy. Every item that had once signaled his dominance was now just a lot number in a glossy catalogue. Isabella Calloway sat in the front row, seat A1. She was an island of calm in a sea of whispering socialites. She wore white, a sharp structural suit by Alexander McQueen that suggested not a grieving ex-wife, but a conquering general. Beside her sat Sebastian Gray, checking the bidding metrics on his tablet with a bored expression. Lot 45, the auctioneer announced, his British accent crisp and unyielding. The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, a high-end reproduction commissioned for the CEO's private office. Starting bid at $5,000. Isabella watched as the paddle wars began. Men who had once begged Richard for meetings were now fighting to buy his office chair, his humidor, even the fountain pens he used to sign billion-dollar deals. It was a grotesque display of how quickly power transfers in the city. Isabella didn't raise her paddle for the art. She didn't bid on the yacht, which went for a fraction of its value to a Russian oligarch. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Finally, the room grew quiet. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the final item of the evening. Lot 100. A hush fell over the room. Behind the auctioneer, a large screen displayed an aerial photograph of the 42-story glass monolith on Fifth Avenue, the headquarters of Sterling Global. We are bidding on the naming rights to the property at 640 Fifth Avenue, the auctioneer intoned. As per the bankruptcy restructuring agreement, the current branding is to be removed. The winner of this lot will hold the naming rights for the next 99 years. This was it. The ultimate erasure. Richard's name was being scrubbed from the skyline. Do I hear 10 million? 10 million, a real estate developer shouted from the back. 12, a tech CEO countered instantly. 14 million, a voice from the telephone bank called out. The price climbed steadily, fueled by ego. To put one's name on that building was to claim the heart of Manhattan. The room was buzzing. 18 million, the developer shouted, sweating. $18 million. 18 million going once. Isabella slowly raised her paddle. She didn't look around. She didn't look at the developer. She looked straight at the screen where the Sterling Tower stood tall and proud. 20 million, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a diamond cutter through glass. The room gasped. Heads snapped toward the front row. Sebastian Gray allowed himself a small, rare smile. I have 20 million from Miss Calloway, the auctioneer said, unable to hide a flicker of surprise. Do I hear 22? Silence. The developer shook his head, dropping his paddle. No one dared to bid against her. They knew who she was now. They knew she was backed by the Von Hart's fortune, by the consortium, by a power they couldn't calculate. 20 million going once, the auctioneer cried, the gavel raised high. Twice. Sold. To Ms. Isabella Calloway. The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. It was over. The Sterling era was officially dead. 1 month later, the spring sun was trying hard to warm the concrete canyons of New York City. Richard Sterling stepped out of the subway station in Queens. The air here smelled different than the Upper East Side. It smelled of exhaust, frying onions, and humanity. He adjusted the collar of his coat. It was an off-the-rack wool blend, not cashmere. It scratched his neck slightly, a constant tactile reminder of his new reality. He walked toward the small logistics firm where he now worked as a senior consultant. It wasn't glamorous. He managed supply chains for a trucking fleet. No one called him Sir or Mr. Sterling with that trembling reverence anymore. They just called him Rich. He stopped at a corner bodega to buy a coffee. Regular milk, 2 sugars, paper cup. He paid with cash. He was happy. It was a strange foreign emotion that had taken him months to identify. For 30 years, Richard had lived with a crushing weight on his chest, the need to be bigger, richer, and louder than everyone else. The fear of being exposed as a fraud had kept him awake every night. Now the worst had happened. He had been exposed. He had lost the money, the wife, the reputation, and he was still breathing. The sun still shone, the coffee still tasted good. He took the subway into Manhattan that morning for a mandatory court appearance regarding the final dissolution of his personal assets. As he walked down Fifth Avenue afterward, he heard the grinding sound of heavy machinery. Crowds were gathering on the sidewalk, looking up. Richard stopped. He knew exactly where he was. Cranes were clinging to the side of his former tower like mechanical spiders. Workmen in orange vests were torching through the steel brackets that held the massive chrome letters in place. He watched as the S swung free, dangling precariously in the wind before being lowered onto a flatbed truck. Then the T, then the E. A man standing next to Richard, a tourist with a camera, pointed up. "Hey look, the new letters are already going up on the other side." Richard squinted against the glare. Slowly, methodically, the new branding was hoisted into place. It wasn't chrome. It was a burnished, matte gold, elegant, understated, permanent. Calloway Callaway Hall. The letters glinted in the sunlight. Isabella hadn't just taken his building, she had turned it into a monument. He had read in the papers that it was being converted into a center for the arts, a sanctuary for painters, sculptors, and musicians, funded by the Von Hartz Trust. The penthouse, his former palace of ego, was being gutted to become a library open to scholarship students. Richard stared at the name. Callaway. It looked right. It looked like it belonged there. He waited for the anger to come. He waited for the bitterness that had consumed him during the divorce proceedings. But it didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange lightness. The building wasn't his burden anymore. The legacy wasn't his to uphold. He was just a man in a scratchy coat, drinking bodega coffee. "That's a nice name," the tourist commented to Richard. "Classy." Richard smiled, a genuine crinkle-eyed smile that he hadn't worn in years. "Yes," Richard said softly. "She always had the best taste." He turned his back on the tower, tossed his empty coffee cup into a trash can, and walked toward the subway. He had a shift starting at 2 p.m., and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be late. The Harrington Gala, 1 year later, the Royal Albert Hall in London was ablaze with light. The gala had returned, more opulent than ever. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. Isabella Callaway stood on the private balcony of the royal box, away from the noise of the orchestra and the clinking of champagne flutes. The night air was cool against her skin. She was wearing emerald green this year, the color of life, of growth, of spring. She rested her hands on the stone balustrade. On her finger, the Star of Andalusia hummed with blue fire. It was heavy, a reminder of the responsibilities she now carried. She was no longer just a socialite. She was a titan of industry, a gatekeeper of culture, a woman feared and respected in equal measure. The door behind her creaked open. Lord Evelyn Harrington stepped out, holding 2 glasses of vintage Krug. "I thought I might find you out here," Harrington said, handing her a glass. "You've achieved quite the victory, my dear. The consortium is stable, the foundation is thriving, and I hear the opening of Callaway Hall was a sensation." "It's coming along," Isabella said, taking the glass. "We have our first class of scholarship students starting next month." Harrington leaned against the railing, looking at her with admiration. "You know, they still talk about it. The divorce, the takeover. They call you the Ice Queen now." Isabella laughed softly. It was a warm, rich sound. "Let them talk, Evelyn. They can call me whatever they like." "Do you ever miss him?" Harrington asked, his voice dropping. "Or the life you had before?" Isabella looked out over the London skyline, the city lights twinkling like the diamonds in the room behind her. She thought of Richard, not with malice, but with the distant fondness one feels for a lesson learned. She thought of the silence of the farmhouse in Connecticut, the dirt under her fingernails, the solitude that had forged her into steel. "No," Isabella said firmly. "I don't miss the life I had. I was asleep back then." She raised her glass, the bubbles catching the moonlight. "I was a ghost in my own marriage, Evelyn. Silent, invisible." She turned to face him, her eyes bright and alive. "But winter is over," she whispered, a smile playing on her lips. "And I have finally learned how to roar." She clinked her glass against his, a clear bell-like sound that rang out into the night. "To the future," Harrington said. "No," Isabella corrected him, turning back to the party where the world was waiting for her command. "To the present." And that is how Isabella Calloway turned her silence into a weapon and her heartbreak into an empire. She didn't just win the divorce, she rewrote the definition of victory. Richard lost because he thought power was about noise and flash. Isabella won because she knew that true power is patience. She let him think he was the king, right up until the moment she checkmated him. What a ride, right? It just goes to show, never underestimate the person who stays quiet during the storm. They're usually the one planning the lightning strike. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, redemption, and high-stakes drama, do me a huge favor, smash that like button. It helps the channel growing more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, where we dive deep into the lives of the secret elite, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a part. What would you have done in Isabella's shoes? Would you have saved Richard at the end, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. And remember, silence isn't empty. It's full of answers.